Your brain ran a simulation of tomorrow's meeting 4 times last night. In every version, something went wrong. You rehearsed embarrassment, rejection, and failure with the kind of detail and commitment most people reserve for actual job training. And the worst part is, you probably thought you were just being prepared. Here's what's actually happening. Your imagination is one of the most powerful tools your biology gave you. Humans are the only species that can sit perfectly still in a safe room and manufacture a full-body stress response from pure fiction. A gazelle on the savannah calms down the moment the lion disappears. You can keep the lion alive for weeks, months. You can build entire savannas that don't exist and populate them with threats that never materialize. The mechanism behind this is straightforward. Your brain processes vivid mental imagery through many of the same regions it uses to process real sensory experience. When you picture yourself bombing a presentation, your body responds as if you're actually bombing it. Heart rate shifts, muscles tense, breathing changes. Your biology can't fully distinguish between a well-constructed mental rehearsal and the real event. This is the same principle that makes visualization useful for athletes. A pianist mentally practicing a piece shows measurable activation in the motor areas associated with finger movement. The mental rehearsal strengthens the same circuits the physical practice would. So when you spend 20 minutes in bed imagining a conversation going sideways, you're training. Specifically, repeatedly. You're building fluency in a version of reality that may never arrive. And most people do this constantly, without recognizing it as a skill being applied in the wrong direction. Think about the sheer volume. An average person spends a significant portion of their waking hours in some form of mental simulation. Much of that time skews negative. You replay arguments that ended years ago. You pre-live confrontations that haven't been scheduled. You draft entire failure scenarios with the narrative complexity of a short film, complete with dialogue, facial expressions, and the specific tone of voice someone might use when they deliver bad news. Each of those rehearsals burns real metabolic resources. Your body allocates energy to a threat response. Stress hormones circulate. Sleep quality drops because you spent the hour before bed in a self-directed horror movie. And here's the part that makes this a compounding problem rather than a momentary one. Every time you rehearse a negative outcome vividly, you make that specific outcome easier to imagine next time. The pathway gets smoother, faster, more automatic. What starts as a conscious worry becomes an unconscious default. You stop choosing to imagine failure. Failure becomes the first channel your imagination tunes to whenever uncertainty appears. This creates a brutal feedback loop. Uncertainty triggers mental simulation. Mental simulation defaults to negative outcomes. Negative outcomes generate a stress response. The stress response narrows your thinking, which makes creative problem-solving harder, which generates more uncertainty. The cycle feeds itself. You've probably noticed this in small ways. You worry about a flight being delayed, and by the time you reach the airport, your shoulders are concrete, the flight board's on time. Nothing happened, but your body spent 4 hours responding to a disaster movie you wrote and directed and starred in. Those 4 hours of stress were real. The event was fiction. Now multiply that by every uncertain situation in a given week. A job interview, a medical appointment, a difficult conversation with a partner, a financial decision. Each one becomes a prompt for your imagination to spin up its worst-case generator. And because the negative rehearsals feel productive, because worry disguises itself as preparation, most people never question the habit. There's a critical difference between preparation and rehearsal. Preparation looks like making a plan, gathering information, practicing a skill. It produces something usable. Rehearsal of worst-case scenarios produces nothing except a worn groove in your stress response. You don't emerge from a worry session with better strategies. You emerge tired, tense, and more convinced the bad outcome is likely. Researchers studying chronic worriers found something worth sitting with. People who habitually catastrophize consistently overestimate both the probability and the severity of negative events. But they also underestimate their own ability to cope. The imagination trains them to see threats as larger and themselves as smaller. Over time, this distortion starts to feel like realism. The worrier genuinely believes they're the clear-eyed one, the person who sees what others miss. In reality, they're watching a biased highlight reel their own brain assembled from selective evidence. The gap between worry and actual outcomes is staggering. Studies tracking predicted versus actual outcomes in chronic warriors found that the vast majority of feared events either never happened or were far less severe than imagined. And, in the cases where something difficult did occur, people coped better than they'd predicted. The mental simulation was wrong in both directions. The threat was smaller, and the person was stronger. So why does the brain default to this? Evolutionary math. For most of human history, the cost of missing a real threat was death. The cost of a false alarm was just some wasted energy. A brain bias toward imagining danger kept you alive on the savannah. The problem is, you're running savannah software in a world of spreadsheets and email notifications. The bias that kept your ancestors breathing is now keeping you awake at 3 in the morning rehearsing an HR meeting. That old wiring shows up everywhere once you start looking. You check your phone for bad news, you scan ruse for social threats, you interpret ambiguous facial expressions as disapproval. And every time your imagination fills an uncertain gap with a negative prediction, it reinforces the same pattern. The bias feeds itself. But the mechanism cuts both ways, and this is where things get interesting. If your brain processes vivid positive imagery through the same pathways as vivid negative imagery, then deliberate positive rehearsal should produce measurable effects too. And it does. Athletes have known this for decades. A basketball player who mentally rehearses free throws with vivid sensory detail, the weight of the ball, the sound of the bounce, the arc through the air, shows measurable improvement in actual performance. The mental practice and the physical practice converge on the same neural territory. This transfers directly to everyday scenarios. When you deliberately rehearse a conversation going well, with the same sensory detail you'd normally invest in catastrophe, your body responds differently. Muscle tension decreases. Your breathing pattern shifts. You walk into the actual situation with a different physiological baseline. You're calmer, which makes you more articulate, which makes the conversation more likely to go the way you rehearsed. The positive simulation becomes partially self-fulfilling, just as the negative one does. The key word is deliberate. Negative rehearsal is automatic. It doesn't need your permission. Positive rehearsal requires conscious effort, especially at first. You're overriding a default that's been reinforced for years, possibly decades. The first few attempts will feel forced, artificial, even naive. That resistance is the old groove asserting itself. A practical approach that researchers in clinical psychology have used. When you catch yourself mid-catastrophe, pause the simulation. Acknowledge it, then rewrite the scene. Same setting, same characters, same uncertainty, different outcome. Make it specific. Make it sensory. Give it the same level of detail your worry would have produced. The smell of the room, the sound of your own voice, steady. The moment where the other person nods, you're training the same simulation engine. You're just feeding it different scripts. This takes repetition. The negative groove didn't form in a day. It won't be redirected in one either. But every deliberate positive rehearsal is a small countervote against the automatic default. Over weeks, the balance shifts. The first channel your imagination tunes to, when uncertainty appears, starts to change. Slowly, then noticeably. There's a subtlety here that matters. The goal isn't toxic positivity. Imagining everything will be perfect is just another form of inaccurate simulation. The goal is realistic rehearsal of competent responses. You imagine yourself handling difficulty well, coping with setbacks, staying resourceful when things get complicated. You rehearse resilience, which is different from rehearsing paradise. The person who mentally practices staying composed during a tough conversation is doing something fundamentally different from the person who imagines the conversation never gets tough. One builds capacity, the other builds fragility, dressed up as optimism. You've been practicing this skill your entire life. Every night you spent awake running disaster scenarios, you are proving how powerful your imagination is. The vividness, the detail, the emotional intensity, all of that creative energy was real. It was just pointed at a target that drained you instead of one that built you. The simulation engine works. It always has. The question you've never been asked to consider is simple. Who's writing the script?